I find that voice hilarious.
I know. I'm recording in progress. Okay, some people are rolling in. Hey, everybody. Welcome, welcome. Welcome to Letterform Lectures 2023.
Okay. Even if the audience is just you two, I'm pretty happy to give this.
I promise to laugh at all your jokes. Actually, I'm going to be on mute, so you won't hear me, but you'll know I'm laughing because I'm going to be cracking up. All right, let's get started with this this act here. Hello, everybody. My name's Grendel. I'm Education Director at Letterform Archive. And as you're coming in, we'd love to hear where you are based. So please type in where you're coming from in the chat. And also, let us know what brought you here. How did you find out about it? Or why are you interested in Hui Jing's talk anyway? So if you want to drop us that information, that'd be awesome. As you're letting us know where you're coming from. So I want to give, first of all, a huge shout out to Skilla Zaccolini. She is the one greasing the gears behind the scenes on this lecture series. So thank you so much, Skilla. As always, you are the best. Okay. Letterform Archive is also the home of Type West, which is our school of type design. So, you know, if you have a typeface inside of you that's clawing, trying to get out, we'll help set it free. We have both 10-week courses and a year-long postgraduate certificate program in type design. And we also host public workshops and a bunch more great lectures coming up this year. I'm going to tell you about a few of them. If you're in the Bay Area or planning a trip, don't miss this one. Cut It Out with Dorothy Yuki. This in-person workshop held at Letterform Archive will get your craft on. Dorothy will help you create new, exciting letter forms just using a snap knife and a folding bone on craft paper. No extra charge for the Band-Aids, people. Just kidding. This will be a lot of creative, crafty fun. And speaking of crafty, our next in-person public workshop is Small Matters with Tammy Knight. You can become a micro curator of your own miniature art gallery in this amazing in-person workshop led by artist Tammy Knight. This is the adult version of that diorama you got to make when you were in 6th grade, and it is literally going to be that much fun. All materials are provided. Do not miss out on this. Okay, next up in our Letterform Lecture series, we've got Mexican rótulos, an endangered species. We hope not, okay? But check in on July 25th as Romina Hernandez explains the precarious state that the Mexican sign painting tradition finds itself in today, and hopefully how it can be helped to continue. And for all of our events, you can go to letarc.org/events. Something else you might want to check out if you're in town, we have an exhibition up. It's time to roll on into the archive and check out Subscription to Mischief, which is a groundbreaking exhibition on graffiti writing in the 1990s. Just don't tag the elevator on your way out. And we have a new docent program coming up. So if you love the archive and you would like to help us out and get a stipend for your work, woo, sign up now. You get good karma, you get massive appreciation, and you're going to get some cash. So consider becoming one of our wonderful docents. Go to letarc.org to find out more. And to help keep great lectures like this one today going, go to letarc.org/join and become a member today. Don't forget to follow us on Instagram to stay on top of upcoming events and programs. We've got 2 that you can follow, Letterform Archive and Type West, to see what the type design students are doing. All right, welcome to Letterform Lectures 2023. Co-presented by Letterform Archive and the SFPL. book arts, and special collections. Letterform Archive is a nonprofit institution housing over 100,000 pieces of graphic design history. Come visit us sometime and let us show you what we mean by radical accessibility. And we have to thank Adobe for generously sponsoring the video recording of this lecture series. All right, the main event, what we've been waiting for. Put your handkerchiefs down forever, as Jing explains how to avoid the 5 stages of grief that usually accompany designing on the web with CSS. Chen Jing is a self-taught designer and developer living in Singapore, and she has learned to live with and love CSS, and she is now on a mission to spread the good news to her fellow web developers. Welcome, Jing.
Hello, everyone. So happy to be here.
All right, you can share now, and I am turning my camera off. Take it away, Jing.
All righty, so yes, I gotta do the typical Zoom thing of like, oh, can everyone hear me and see my screen?
You're on. We gotcha.
Amazing. All right, so hello, everyone. Thank you all here. Thank you all for being here today. And I personally have been a member of the Letterform Archive since 2018, and I'm kind of jealous of those of you who are actually based in SF because you have so many like exciting events and like talks to go to in person. You can even visit the archive. I only been there once, like years, way back, years ago when I visited the States. But having this opportunity to present a Letterform lecture, albeit online, is still pretty surreal and mind-blowing to me. So I would like to shout out to, organizers for actually having me here today. Now, as you can see from the title, this talk might be a little bit different from the other Letterform lectures in that it leans a little bit more toward technology than design. It's kind of, more similar to maybe the really excellent A Bite-Sized History of Computer Typography with Ben Zato that happened back in February. I really like that one, and I recommend you watch it if you haven't yet. Now, my name is Jing, and it's a Chinese name, so our family name comes first. And those are like my representative emojis, if you will. And I've been gainfully employed as a web developer for more than a decade. And in that time, I've had the opportunity to work with many different designers. And today, I'd just like to share some of those experiences and maybe a little bit of knowledge that could potentially help improve communication between the two groups, right? Because I don't think developers and designers should have an adversarial relationship, right? We all build for the web, and we should be working together in a very harmonious manner. But first, I want to start off with a little bit of history just to build up a bit more context on how we got to where we are today. And I don't want to assume that everybody knows what CSS stands for. It's short for Cascading Style Sheets. And simply put, it's a mechanism for adding styles to web documents. And there's a defined syntax with those semicolons and curly braces and all of that. It's just so that all the different browsers can understand and parse our instructions correctly. So when a designer asks us to, oh, can you make that logo like a tad larger, or please move this banner to like the bottom right corner, CSS is what we use to make those changes to a web page. And I will go into type specific CSS later on in the talk, but like context. Let's build up some context. Fonts on the web are essentially digital fonts, right? And digital fonts are a significant change from what was being used for the physical process of printing. So instead of like metal alloys or stone or wood, these are things that we can touch and feel, right? Digital fonts exist as light. And light is kind of almost ethereal, right? You don't touch it, you don't feel it. Now, one of the things that came up during my research and I feel important for me to mention is that the first Japanese patent for photo typesetting was filed by Nobuo Morisawa and Ishii Mokichi back in 1924. And that was the same Morisawa who founded Morisawa Inc., currently still one of Japan's leading font foundries. Now, they kind of, clearly they did hardware back then, but the point is, this anecdote isn't always mentioned when photo typesetting history is talked about. And in my opinion, it should be. Now, this change in medium, right, from physical to light, this change in medium brought about new design constraints because projected light is it's really less sharp and less crisp if you compare it to like solid metal types, right? So type designers, had to modify their characters to suit the technology that was manifesting their designs in real life. So if you're a designer, you can't get away from the medium you're working in, right? And Adrian Frutiger, when he was interviewed and talking about like redrawing his fonts for the Lumatype machine, he described the changes that he had to make. He called them aberrations. So clearly he wasn't very pleased about it. But it is what it is. That's the technology, that's the constraint, and that's the outcome of your design. Now, the very first instance of digital typesetting where there was absolutely no physical material involved in the creation of the characters is this machine called the Digiset 50T1. And it's a third generation CRT typesetter. So I can't see any of you, so I don't know how old any of you are, but like I'm probably dating myself. But back when I was a kid, flat screens were not a thing, right? Either televisions or even like computer monitors were this big heavy cuboids, and those are powered by CRT, cathode ray tubes. So what cathode ray tubes do is that they sweep electron beams across the screen, like one row at a time from top to bottom. And there are numerous illuminated screen points. Each of these illuminated screen points is a pixel, right? So this machine here, Digiset 50T1, was developed by Dr. Rudolf Hell in 1964. Now, the introduction of CRT screens for typesetting was again a milestone for type design simply because of how this technology worked, right? Because for a format like that, your characters have to be converted into bitmap, and bitmap, like it's got a low resolution, right? It's like not great, and so you kind of almost had this shift to, if you were doing type design specifically for these digital screens, it's like, oh man, you had limit. There was again a design constraint, right? But like fast forward to 84, it's like a couple decades later. Small company called Adobe, they released PostScript in 84. PostScript was released in 84. And this was the first ever vector font format. And this is a milestone because it marked a swing back to high resolution land for type designers, right? Vector fonts. Then in 87, when Adobe had around only like 70 employees worldwide, like I said, it was small at the time. Current CEO of Morisawa, Akihiko Morisawa, who, if you notice the name, it's like he is actually the grandson of the original founder. Akihiko Morisawa, he went to the United States to take a training course at Adobe and was mentored by the Adobe founders. So Morisawa, like this Japanese company, and Adobe developed this wonderful working relationship that's still going today. And what they did was that they worked together to further develop this PostScript format, because like the Japanese script and the Japanese language needed a lot more features for it to work properly in a digital setting. So talking about PostScript, this is a great segue to start going into font formats, right? Different font formats, as you can see, there are a lot of them, right? All of them weird acronyms. These different font formats, basically what they do is, it's data, right? It stores information about the font, like, oh, what glyphs they are, what encodings, is there any metadata about the fonts? All this information is stored in the font format, and they differ. The different formats differ based on how their specifications were written. Now, given how successful PostScript was, Apple and Microsoft worked together to come up with a new format called TrueType. And that's TTF, And I mean, it's still used today, right? Like a lot of us, we're still like buying, downloading fonts in TTF. Microsoft also continued to work on it, came up with a preliminary version called TrueType Open in '94, but then, oh, Adobe joined them, and together they've developed OpenType, OTF, another format that's still being used today. What I love is that like all these like competitors ended up just working with each other to come up with cool stuff. But for the web specifically, and even though TTF and OTF, you can use them on the web, the format that you would see most commonly on web pages is this thing called WOF, and it stands for Web Open Font Format. WOF 2 is simply an improvement over WOF, but with significantly better compression rates. And I talk about compression rates because they're very significant when it comes to web pages. This is because of the nature of how we load content in the browser, of how these resources, these images and fonts, how they get delivered to our end users. Because most people probably don't give a second thought to how the content appears on their screen when they click a link or whatever. But a lot of us notice when the page takes forever to load, right? Because it's not a great experience. You want instant content now. So to explain that, we kind of have to, this is a very abridged version of how the web works. So, I'm taking some liberties here for the sake of simplicity. But whenever you enter a URL into an address bar or when you click a link, they all have this format, right? HTTP, www, dot, da, 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 da. The format starts with a protocol, and then there's a server, and then there's like everything else. That's a file path. And people love to talk about the cloud like it's some invisible sea of data floating above your heads. But honestly, it's all physical servers housed in, most likely nondescript concrete buildings all across the world, most likely in lower temperature countries, because gotta cool that shit down. And they're all just connected via reams and reams of fiberglass or copper cables. It's really not as sexy as the media makes it out to be. Trust me, I'm a nerd. But anyway, so this .com portion of the URL, right? It's the human readable address for the server on which your content lives in. So once you click this link or you press enter on your address bar, the browser on your device is going to send a request to the server, kind of like column it, like, hey, I need this piece of content. The server is going to like take your request, like, oh, okay, you need this, right? It's going to go handle the request and return you the correct content that you asked for. So it's kind of almost like a conversation, right? First request that you send over, server's going to give you back this base HTML file, and then your browser is going to start reading it from top to bottom in sequence. So along the way, if it encounters any additional required resources, it could be CSS, it could be JavaScript, it could be like images, media files, fonts, etc. It's going to make additional calls back to the server to get them. So it's kind of like, hey, I need more, I need the CSS, send it back by, hey, I need this JavaScript, send it back by, fonts, so on and so forth, like back and forth, until the whole thing, until your browser's done reading the file, like, oh, done, finally. So a major reason why web pages take so long to load these days is because of all these additional required resources being requested from the server. Sometimes you're even requesting multiple different servers because sometimes your resources need more resources. So if you think about things like ad banners, or if there are any third-party extensions that live somewhere else, every resource that we send down the line takes up bandwidth. So, this is a public service announcement almost, but like I really feel it's important that we only send what is necessary and ensure that we've optimized them, make them as small as possible beforehand. Now I don't want to drag on anybody. I just randomly found this website on a forum thread where people were asked, so what's the most bloated website you've ever encountered? And boy, was there a really long list. I just picked one at random, right? And I'm pretty sure this is not the most bloated website on the internet. But, I kind of scrolled it a bit just now. You kind of see, it's not the most complicated website I've ever seen. It's like a news site, there's a list of articles and stuff. So, do you really need 490 requests to display a list of Or I mean, I just think, like, no judgment, but I just think could be a little lighter and a little faster. That's all I'm saying. So like the next time you're designing something, I think it's good to, you don't, if you're not a developer, you don't have to know the mechanics exactly of how this works, but kind of just keep it at the back of your mind. Like it would be better if we could keep things smaller, just as a general rule of thumb, right? Okay, PSA over. Now, I mean, when it comes to page weight, honestly, images are the lowest hanging fruit, because like you could easily save a significant chunk of bandwidth by optimizing like a 5 megabyte image file down to maybe a couple hundred kilobytes with minimal loss in image quality. Like technology is there. So images, yes, they're the lowest hanging fruit, but there are savings to be had for font files as well, because there's this concept known as font subsetting, where you can choose to provide only a limited range of characters to your users, because some fonts, especially those who cover like a lot of character sets, right? They could go up to even like a megabyte or so. And so there are numerous applications, both online and offline, that actually allow you to do this. Like the ones that I'm showing here is just a few of them. They are font services, cloud font services. I love the word cloud. Anyway, font services like Monotype and Typekit, they do offer this option called dynamic subsetting, where the font files will be served only with the glyphs needed on each page. There are limitations to the solutions that we have today, because sometimes you might lose OpenType features during subsetting. There might even be caching issues and things like that. So what I'm trying to say is that the solutions we have right now are not good enough. Fortunately, there have been developments in this realm of how digital fonts are working. One of them is variable fonts, which was pretty hot stuff on the web when they first were released a couple of years ago. Now they're fairly stable, but variable fonts are pretty fun because they allow one single font file to contain all the styles and weights that the designer intended to have via this thing called variation axes. So developers like me, right, I can access these styles and weights via CSS. And sending one single font file to your users already has, you know, performance benefits, because the overall size of the font files that you have to send is lower, it's fewer file requests, and like your developer can do funky things and like mess around with the file. So there's like creative opportunities there as well. In addition to this, which is already available now, there are things in the pipeline that might be available in the future. There's this ongoing industry-wide collaboration between the big players, the Adobe, Google, and some of the type foundries, to resolve this issue of font file size transferring over the internet. And there's this proposed solution that's being developed into a formal W3C specification. A W3C specification essentially is like a guideline, right? Think of it like it's a big document, very comprehensive, that people who create browsers, right, those developers who code up the browser, they can refer to this to implement the feature into the browser. So it needs to know exactly, like the developers need to know exactly how this feature works to implement it correctly. So the spec is being written right now. And the premise is to allow the subsetting of a font request to only what's required on a page. So for example, if my web page was only the single slide, you can see like it has, you know, all the letters of the alphabet, like maybe not the letter Z. I don't think the letter Z is in there. Like you can send down only the characters that are needed. But if, like, for example, the letter Z comes up at some point, you can progressively add on to the original font request. So if this sounds completely complicated and just went over your head, that's totally fine, because it's complicated even to me, which means there's a lot to be ironed out. So it's still being worked on, but this is very promising stuff. We can see a prototype of this concept in action by this demo that was done by the Google Fonts team a couple years back when they first started like working on this. Like the example is adding additional fonts, additional text from different scripts. And so you can see that what we have today ends up being like a really large amount of fonts that have to be sent over the wire, but the proposed solution has significant savings. So this is really promising stuff, and I'm glad that they're still actively working on it, because the thing about web specifications is that a lot of things get started, but not everything gets finished. And this is one of the things that seems to be on track to eventually getting finished. So I have high hopes. But like, yeah, we've covered up like the logistics of font delivery over the internet. I think we should move on to how to properly use these font files once we were able to get them on a web page. So let's move on to some CSS, right? Now, there are designers in the audience. Like, the scenario is like when you're designing something, right? Like, you got a new project, and then you come across this font, like, this will work for my project really well. You get a hold of some new fonts. You have to install them, right? You actually have to, like, click on them, install them onto your computer before you can use them in the design software of your choice, right? Now, back in the earliest days of the web, there was actually no way for you to use fonts that hadn't already been pre-installed with the system. So you're kind of stuck with like Arial and Times New Roman. Hey, great fonts. But like at the time, at the earliest days of the web, right, in the mid-90s, you couldn't. And so this is clearly a limitation. A lot of people are like, hey, I have these really great fonts, like I want to use them. So therefore, the browsers evolve, right? They're like, okay, I guess this is a feature everyone wants. Let's make the browser be able to download additional font files from a specified location so that we can use them on a web page. And so that's what we have today. And you can tell the browser where to get these font files using CSS. Because CSS, in a way, is a set of instructions that we give to the browser. Like, we tell the browser, like, I want the content to look this way, but our language of communication just happens to be CSS. Now, the point of this lecture is not to make you all start writing CSS. Although I would be very happy if you found it interesting enough to decide to learn. But I just wanted to give you an idea of how the developers you work with kind of go through their day, right? So what you see on the screen here, it's called a font-based rule. It's CSS. And it tells the browser like the name of a font family and where to find the font files. So here, what I'm doing, like in plain English, I'm telling the browser, like, okay, I'm gonna put these, I have these 3 font files, and I'm gonna call them Magnetic Pro. So if I refer to Magnetic Pro anywhere else in my code, you know that I'm talking about this. And then there are these 3 font files, and they differ, as you can see. If there is a font style that is set to italic, use that italic font file. If the font weight is bold, then you use that bold. Like, these are just instructions, right? I'm telling the browser, like, this is how the font's going to work. So when you use them, this is how it's going to behave. And so in order to use the font, I then give another instruction. I'm like, okay, for every H1 on the page, please use Magnetic Pro. And as you can see, I've provided a list of different fonts for the font family property because, and this is known as a font stack, right? And this is actually pretty important because browsers use a font matching algorithm to determine which font to use for every single character that appears on the screen. So again, this is an abridged version, again, taking liberties for the sake of simplicity on how it actually works. But the long and short of it is when the browser encounters a font stack like this, right, it's going to take the first name on the list. So it's not a generic keyword like sans serif. It's going to try to find the font file. So it's going to check if it has been declared as a font-based rule or not. Now, once you find the family, the browser has to assemble the set of different variations. Like just now, I had 3 files, right? So it has to assemble the whole family and then check if that specific character that it needs to render exists in the glyphs in that family. So if it doesn't, it's going to have to move to the next font on the list, run through the entire process until all the fonts on the list have been exhausted. Now, with the widespread adoption of Unicode these days, the odds that the browser encounters a character it simply cannot render, like it doesn't know where it is, the odds of that happening are pretty low. In the event it does happen, you're gonna see a blank rectangle. Sometimes the blank rectangle, it's so hard to say blank rectangle. The blank rectangle might have a code point in it, just to tell you like, hey, this is the character I can't render, sorry. Yeah, no, someone helpfully said like tofu. Tofu is much more pronounceable way of describing blank rectangle. But essentially it's the browser's way of telling you like, I'm so sorry, but I don't know how to deal with this character. And honestly, this doesn't happen as much these days, right? But the more common issue we see today is if the fallback font choice doesn't match the main font well enough. And then it becomes kind of painfully obvious that the font is missing specific glyphs. Because ideally, okay, and this is the part where I feel designers can be more hands-on when talking to a developer and tell us what the font stack should be, because ideally your font stack should be made up of fonts that share similar characteristics. So things with, you want like similar visual styles, X heights and stroke weights. So even if the fallback font gets invoked, it's not too obvious. You know, you squint, you're like, it looks the same. Yeah, that would be ideal, right? Now, in terms of browser tools, the Firefox font tools is still the most full-featured tool available today. So what you can do if you happen to have Firefox installed is you right-click on some text on a web page, you select inspect, and you bring up DevTools. Firefox has this option, this additional feature for a fonts panel. Now, this fonts panel is going to show you what fonts are loaded on the page and which fonts are being loaded for which characters on your page. So it's very granular. And then you have a lot of information about fonts on the page. So this tool comes in pretty handy. Personally, my experience is when I did multilingual websites, or even sites with a handful of foreign words. And sometimes the typeface you've chosen doesn't support all the required characters. So an example I'm going to show here is this round sans serif is called Railway. And it's designed by the League of Movable Type. I think it's a pretty nice, it's a round sans serif, pretty nice. It doesn't support Cyrillic characters, unfortunately. So if I happen to have some Cyrillic runs of text on the page, it's gonna look a little wonky. But from a developer's perspective, what we can do is that if you manage to find a font that does support Cyrillic and somehow matches up, so I found this one called Comforta, does support Cyrillic, the developer can utilize a CSS descriptor called Unicode range to create something known as a composite font. Now, it's called a composite font because it mixes glyphs from different fonts for different scripts. So I'm using this thing called a Unicode range descriptor to tell the browser to load a different font file when it encounters this range of Cyrillic characters. Because for font-based rules, font family is a label. So what I've done here is that even though the font I'm loading for Cyrillic characters is Comforter, the file is Comforter, I can still tell the browser that it's part of the Railway family. So now Railway has become a composite font. So if you do happen to use the font highlighter, it kind of gives away what the browser is doing when such a scenario happens. Because you can see that for the Cyrillic text, even though the browser recognizes the whole font as Railway, it can tell you that like, oh, I'm loading which font file. So that's why I find this font tool particularly helpful in that scenario. And honestly, I consider CSS the one and only typesetting tool that we do have for the web. And browsers do have a number of sensible typographic defaults out the box, but it's very important that I say we, but I mean developers, we have to tell the browser exactly what language the content is in. Now, this is very important because language and writing system conventions, they do affect a lot of typographic effects, right? Like, line breaking or hyphenation, all this stuff depends on what language it is. And a lot of the times, browsers are going to err on the side of caution. So if it doesn't know what language it is in, it's not going to apply any of these typographic tailorings. So usually, like the mechanism for this is that you would set the content of the language on the root element itself. So it's like all the way at the top, I'm like, this HTML's lang is English. The other thing that you see on the right is I feel we being developers, it's not as commonly done, even though it's best practice, is that if they happen to be phrases or sentences in other languages somewhere in between, ideally you'd want to tag them correctly, even though a lot of us, I'll be honest, we don't do this, just say. Now, since CSS is our one and only typesetting tool for web pages, let's understand what's possible. Now, CSS today provides developers with a lot more granular typographic control as compared to the early days. So there are CSS properties for adjustments at the character level, line level, and of course the layout level, but like it's a wide range. This list here is the most commonly seen basic font properties. It's mostly self-explanatory. I'm going to go through the last two because they're very web specific. This particular property was developed to address legibility issues. And I'm not sure if this example makes it clear, but there are two fonts involved. The first is Merriweather, the next is Georgia. And they're both set to the same font size. But Georgia clearly has different X heights. So you can actually set the aspect ratio, and I need to check this, but I believe it's like X height to cap height maybe, but you can set the aspect ratio for your fallback font, and then the browser is going to adjust to make sure that it matches your first choice font. So it kind of it's also helpful for it's a fallback font like helper, so to speak. This other one is called font synthesis. And it's meant to address the issue of faux bolts and faux italics. We use the word faux because it's fake, right? If the font file that you've provided doesn't have a bold version or an italic version, somehow the browser will try to artificially manufacture the bold or italic version. And over the years, many designers have informed me that they are not pleased with the end result. Like they're like, no, it looks terrible. But with this property, font synthesis, you can actually turn this feature off. So like even for Chinese, synthesizing italics is not even necessary. So what I can do is I can change it to none, and then the Chinese italics just get removed. So it's a fairly useful feature, I feel. Now, the open type font format has a lot of features, as you can see. And it has provided a big boost to web fonts because they can include an expanded character set and layout features. And there's so much more linguistic support and typographic control that open type gives us. And the best part is that this typographic control is exposed to developers like me via CSS. So there's CSS called font feature properties. And this is relevant to open type fonts, where like if you provide alternates or like alternate ligatures or swashes or like old style numerals, etc., we can actually toggle them on and off with CSS for specific scenarios. Of course, the caveat is that the font has to have them, right? Like if the font doesn't have alternative ligatures, I can't do anything about that. So I would love for more designers to consider including these properties in your font. So because it was not supported in the past, maybe if the designer knows that this font is only specific for the web, not going to add these features in, but like now they are. And so I understand that it's more effort. And so, you know, of course, it's more work, but the end result is a much more aesthetic typographic experience for the web. So I'm like, think about it, right? Think about it. Now, these predefined font variation properties, they cover kind of more generic use cases like, oh, adjust kerning, oh, I want to switch the ligatures. But there are also more quirky possibilities that font designers can come up with specifically for a dynamic medium like the web. So earlier I talked about variable fonts. So what this font variation settings does is that the designer is exposing this low-level control over specific characteristics of the font to developers like me. And then I can manipulate the font via CSS because I can hook onto these 4-letter axes names. For example, optical sizing for this specific font, it's OPSZ. I can target it, and I can modify the value based on specific user actions. Like I'm moving the slider, and then I can ask, I can change the style. Move this slider, change the style. So this opens a lot of opportunities because unlike a static medium where you can't change, the web is something that can change based on an user input. So I feel that there's a lot of possibility for creativity, especially in the typography space. Now, we've talked quite a bit about character level CSS, and that's not even all of it. I think we need to move on, time. Let's move on to CSS for typography at a line level. And I know I kept harping on the importance of language because the browser depends on knowing what language it is. The browser needs to know the language to know when and how to break lines, for example. There's so much nuance when it comes to word breaking because they all work differently depending on the language you're typesetting for. For example, English, right? English, letters make up words. Words are split by spaces, so you can break it a space. For Chinese or Japanese, the break is per character, usually, but not always, because when certain characters are paired with certain punctuation, there's another set of rules. And then you have some Southeast Asian scripts like Thai, and those are written usually without spaces between words. So when do you wrap the text? You wrap them at syllable boundaries in addition to word boundaries. And there's so much more. There's so much more we could talk about. But essentially, browsers use dictionaries to know how all of this works. And there's quite a bit of logic that goes on behind the scenes to determine exactly where a break should occur because of how all these rules interplay with each other. The point I'm trying to make is that it's complicated, right? But let's have a go of it to try to understand what options we have. So here are some of the CSS that you can use to kind of customize breaking behavior. So word break, it specifies soft wrap opportunities between the characters. So if I set it to a different value like break all, what happens is that the browser is just going to drop anything to the next line at any point just to fit the space. It doesn't care what the word is. Like I wouldn't break when into WH and EN, but the browser doesn't care if you tell it to, right? That's how it works. And then there's another one called keep all that is most relevant only to the CJK characters because of how they work, right? Like I mentioned, CJK characters are character break, per character break. For a language like Korean is interesting because it's a mix. So they do use spaces, but then there are also these individual combinations of characters form words. So if you set it to keep all, it's not going to break the characters between the words. But for Chinese, it doesn't do the spacing thing. You're going to end up with overflow because then the entire sentence doesn't get broken up, right? So these are, it's good that we have these properties because then you can have very granular control over what goes on depending on your language even. Hyphens, on the other hand, are more applicable to the Latin-based scripts and where you can break up words at syllable boundaries. So if I set this to auto, and this is where the dictionary becomes also very important because the browser relies on the dictionary that they have stored to know where the syllable boundaries are. So if it doesn't know what language it's in, hyphens won't kick in at all. So especially, I chose German because I thought German would have a lot of long words. So as you can see, the hyphens do kick in when the browser knows like where to break it at the syllable boundaries. So that's for hyphenation. Overflow wrap is more relevant for like really long words. So these examples are not great. The words are not long enough, but think URLs, right? URLs can go like, I don't know, 30 characters long. So if we resize this, you start to get an overflow when like the words are too long. Only applies for German, I think. Yeah, the German word's really long. So you can set overflow wrap to, I think, anywhere. So if you set it to anywhere, what happens is that when it reaches a point where there's not enough space for the word, you can see themselves is starting to break itself. So that's how it works. So the difference between word break, the first one that I talked about earlier, and overflow wrap is that word break is just going to break it anywhere, but overflow wrap only kicks in when there's not enough space. So like, as you can see, it's already quite complicated how these different properties work and then how they interact with each other, right? So the long and short of it is that please tag the language of your content correctly. Like there's even additional values for overflow wrap because you can set it to something called break word. And it doesn't seem like it's doing anything, but if you set the width of the container to a very web specific value called min content. And so what min content is the amount of space that is required for the longest unbreaking word in a run of text. So in this case, themselves is the longest word for the English run. So the entire container becomes the length of themselves. For Korean, it's per character, so certainly one column. Then for the German one, it's this word that I cannot pronounce. So that's how it works. Now, if you set it to break word, it's going to respect the words, the word lengths. If you set it to anywhere, like it just goes nuts. So like the way these CSS properties work, again, and this is the responsibility of your developer to understand. It's the fact is that like it's very granular control that we have today. And so I think this allows us to have a greater amount of care over how typography works on the web. Because I think for a while, because there was so much that the web couldn't do, people just, let it go like, it's fine, the web, it doesn't work on the web anyway. That phrase is a little bit obsolete now. Like, it doesn't work on the web anyway. You can't use that as an excuse anymore. You gotta come up with a new excuse if you don't want to do, more fine-grained typography. All I'm saying, work on your excuses. This CSS is new. It's only available in Chrome right now. So hey, gonna switch browsers real quick. Slide it down. There we go. Okay, let's. Did not. This one, hey. I really want this one widely available as soon as possible because it's so useful to me as a developer. This property totally resolves the orphan character problem that has caused all of us, so much distress. From developers like me who have had to write extra code just to make sure that text never has orphans, to sometimes it's the content writers who are like, oh, okay, I have to fit this magnificent copy into 250 characters. Like, it's just not fun for anybody. But with this single line of CSS, I can magically type the word balance and the browser can go figure it out on its own. It's amazing because like, if you think about it, the browser knows how much space it has and the browser knows how much text it needs to render. So we should let the browser decide where to break stuff. So I am a big fan of this and I really hope that like all the browsers do it real soon. Okay, how do I bring it back? Oh, come on. Sorry guys, gotta find out where my Do I do this? I lost my slides. That's terrible. Okay, let's do this. I'm gonna open a new browser window. There we go. Okay, the point I was trying to make earlier about different browsers is that this is something that I want everyone to internalize. CSS are browser features. So you know how you update apps on your phone sometimes and then you get something new, you see a change like, oh, new feature. The same happens when you update your browser. Sometimes you get new CSS. So the downside is because all these browsers are made by different vendors, right? They won't all support the newest features at the same time in the beginning. So usually you have to wait a while before everyone gets on board. So you have a bit of a mixed bag experience when something is released for the first time. But that's fine. This is what I want everyone to internalize. That's just the nature of the web as a medium. Now, if you're a designer, my opinion is that you can help your developers out by viewing the page on as many different devices or browsers as possible. And then you can let them know if something looks broken. But broken and looks different are completely separate issues. Because it doesn't, broken means oh, text is overlapping, it's overflowing, I can't read it properly, I can't use the website properly, that's broken. Now, if the design looks different on different browsers and devices, that's fine, because that's a feature, not a bug. So yes, this. But of course, as much as CSS can do today, there are still more things that we can improve upon. One thing is letting. I know that this is always a lot of designers are really perplexed about why does letting work this way on the internet? CSS allocates letting based on line height by, get this, subtracting the ascent and descent from the specified line height. It splits the remainder in half and then gives it to the top and bottom. So it's a half letting situation. Now, I've linked to an excellent article that deep dives into why and how it got to this point and why they decided to do it this way at the start of the web. But the long and short of it is that by doing so, you can get decently even line spacing. Because remember, at the start of the talk, I mentioned that you couldn't use non-system fonts at the start, which means that everyone's text usually ended up with the same font throughout. So if you had that as the base scenario, this way of doing letting would give you kind of decently even line spacing throughout. But fast forward to today, where we potentially have different font families on the same line, or how we design things is different, things end up just not lining up as well because all the different fonts have different ideas of what one M should be, right? What CSS was doing, or what it's still doing today, is that it's guaranteeing that the content will never overlap, right? But this is at the expense of aesthetics. So come on, it's 30 years later. The CSS working group understands that it's a new environment. People are using fonts in different ways. So they are trying to come up with a new algorithm to calculate optimal line size. Okay, this is even newer CSS, so I got to do this browser switching thing again. This one only available in Safari Technology Preview because it's so new. They're just prototyping it right now. What this property does, text box something, it allows you to remove the leading white space. Because if you look at my example, these hot pink lines, there are spaces, right, between the letter, the top of the letter, and the edge of the box. So what you can do is you can even define it. So for this example, I'm just going to set it to the cap height, and I'm trim book. So what happens is that the box surrounding the text now hugs your text exactly. And they're working on various different options. I think you can even do X height. And there might be scenarios for that. And then there's there's more stuff for non-Latin scripts where the font doesn't have X heights or cap heights. And so depending on the font metrics, you have to use something different. There's a value called ideographic, but I don't think it's implemented. Yeah, it's not implemented yet. That's how new this is. But this is what the CSS working group is working on because of demand, right? Demand. People need this feature. CSS working group starts to develop it. So moving on, Another thing that designers are irked about is like vertical rhythm, because strict vertical rhythm goes out the window when you're trying to lay out many different types of content, right? Your text and then your image, and then the vertical rhythm is gone. But it's kind of important if you happen to be doing like multi-column layouts and the content is laid out side by side, you want some sort of alignment. Another proposed new property is something called block step size. There's a whole specification called CSS rhythmic sizing. That's kind of like thinking around all the different scenarios and how this CSS should work, right? The specification itself is currently sourcing for feedback. And it's an open call because all CSS specification development, it's done in the open on this platform called GitHub. So what I'm trying to say is that you don't have to be an engineer to be involved in the process of developing the specifications, because you're the folks that are going to be using the CSS, you and I, right? Developers and designers. We don't build the browser. You know, I don't know how to build a browser, clearly. I only know how to build web pages. But we can still be involved in the process because we're the users of these features. And it would be great for have folks from varying backgrounds who need to use the web for different reasons to chime in on what they like to see on the web. And I feel especially in this area of typography, greater collaboration between type designers and the folks who create and implement CSS is only going to result in a better typographic experience for everyone. So I have included a link to this GitHub platform at the end of the talk. So you can just go poke around and see how things work. So you see like there's lots of discussions, and folks who are working on the CSS actually do respond to questions and feedback. It's pretty vibrant and open. So if you're interested, do take a look. And I believe that I'm at time. So this is the link. The slides are available at the URL. And we'll probably send this later. And so again, thank you all so much for paying attention to me for the past 50 minutes. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Bravo, bravo. Jing, that was amazing.
Thank you.
Yeah, very lively chat going on as well. And I will I'll read the questions out loud as we do the Q&A, and then people, reminder, I saw some great questions out there. You got to put those in the Q&A because I'm not going to read them out of the chat. So let's, but I will also try to transcribe the answers in the Q&A. So we have, okay, the first question from Daniel, will this be available to be viewed later? Yes, yes. The video and chat will be recorded and will be sent out to everyone who registered very soon after. And then the video will also go up on our Vimeo site. So you can check it out there as well. But so yes, I'll just do short answer yes. And then we'll get to questions for Jing. Dario says, what happens to apostrophes and accents when the text box gets trimmed?
This is an excellent question. And I think it's not specified explicitly in the specification, and therefore it's an excellent opportunity for us to ask this in GitHub where they're working on the spec itself. Because okay, so how CSS works is like today I covered all the typography related ones, but even the typography related ones, they're split into separate documents. So the one that contains this one that I talked about the text box trim is in this document called inline layout. And inline layout, there are many different sections to it, and it would, if I were you, or I mean even I could do it, I could ask that question in GitHub. I wonder if I'm still sharing the screen. You can just see how it looks like. So this is how GitHub looks like. So it's a very nerdy website. Yes, yes. And then it's called CSS working drafts. So this is how it looks like. And each of these individual folders contain like a specific specification. So as you can see, there are 2,000 issues simply because this is the mechanism in which the discussions take place. So I think if we do I don't know, we could randomly go apostrophe. I can't spell apostrophe. So difficult. But yeah, okay. So nobody's asked this question yet, and therefore we can ask the question. We can just do a new issue, and then like have a relatively descriptive a title, and then just ask the question like, oh, so what happens to apostrophes and accents when the text box gets trimmed? And then I assure you that someone who's working on the spec is going to respond. It could probably be like, let's discuss this further, or they maybe already thought about something. But that's basically how these things go. And that's how it's important. I feel like it's almost like voting, right? Like it's important for us to be more involved, because if we don't, then the people who create this feature, they don't know that people want this or are concerned about this particular bit of it. And then they just miss it, because like they're human like you and I, and they have different areas of expertise. So this is why the general CSS wants to source for feedback from more parties who use the web. So the long and short of it is, I did not answer your question at all, Dario. I'm sorry.
That was great. I like the way that we just basically answered Dario's question live by asking the question. And Dario, keep your eyes on GitHub here, and maybe your question will be answered soon. Let's see, we got one question from Bob back here. And people, we need more questions. We have Jing online, and Jing is here to answer you. So drop those questions in the Q&A, please. Bob asks, regarding language specifying or targeting, is there a strategy or ordering to prioritize languages for a multilingual site? Can they all be treated as the same priority, or does there need to be a cascading strategy? Haha, good pun there, Bob.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. For multilingual sites, and because usually and I say usually there's always one main language, right? So I'm not sure when you say prioritize what you mean, but I assume that's like what you want to set the main language of the site to. So even if, like, let's say you have like the English version and then you have like a French version /FR, when you click to the French version, it's going to be predominantly French, and then therefore you will set the HTML language to French. It's only when they're interspersed content in a different language that you would want to tag it to a different language. Yeah, exactly. Like Canada, you very often has both English and French versions, right? But I've encountered very few instances where there's equal amount of content, both English and French. I'm sure some people have tried it. Maybe if there's not enough content, there's like the English text and then the French at the bottom. I would, if that's the case, I would say pick one and then tag the corresponding ones in French, or pick French and then tag the corresponding ones in English accordingly. Because there isn't really a cascade for this, simply because the language attributes are set on the HTML and not the CSS. Like the CSS refers to the language when it needs to apply some styles, but this information of what language the content in is set in the HTML. So there's actually no like cascade per se, because like that's not how HTML works. Yeah, hope that answers the question.
Bob says we're trying it with a smile, so hopefully, and then the thank you emoji. It could be a prayer emoji too, like you know, it's hopeless, so just pray. Okay, folks, do we have any more questions for Hui Jing? Time to speak up now, or that's it?
Well,
oh, here we go. Okay, Bob says he thinks he gets it. Okay, good. I'm glad that you're getting it there, Bob. And yes, it was an awesome talk, and thank you very much, Hui Jing. Any more questions? Going once, going twice, don't be shy. Jing, is there anything more you want to say about any of the topics that came up?
I mean, I'm available on social media. Twitter is a shit show, so I'm a bit reluctant to say Twitter. But like there are no really viable alternatives, I guess. I do have a website that has a contact form. So if you ever like, I don't know, you could be like vacuuming your floor and like, oh, I suddenly thought of a question. No, feel free to shoot it over to me. I do check my email, so I can respond like after the fact. And whenever you have something like a question, but yeah, no, I really want to push the like, ask the designers to just go poke around in GitHub. You don't have to be actively involved, but like just poke your head into GitHub, like what I have on the screen, and just like see what's going on. And then eventually, if there's anything particular that you feel strongly enough that like pushes you to get past the inertia to actually click that new issue button, do it. But I think because this is even amongst developers, right? It's not as popular as people think, because there's always this conception that like, oh, it's for the experts who build the browsers, then they can care about these things. But no, people who use the web, like we are the users of the web. Often you must understand that the people who are great at building browsers, they're not designers, you know? They will implement the specification as how it's written. So if designers kind of are involved at the specification writing process, then the end result will be something that the designers want. But if the designers are not involved in up the top, you're gonna get an implementation like, oh, that looks terrible, right? So this is my like public service announcement push to like just don't think that it's a realm that is out of reach for you. No, everyone, as long as you design, build for the web, you use the web even, you can be involved. That's all I want to say.
Okay, now that is a great takeaway from this, because I do feel like many people just feel like that's something completely out of their league and they have no clue, and then something goes wrong and they just grumble, you know, as opposed to knowing where to go to prevent it from being a problem in the first place.
Exactly.
Okay, folks, pending no further questions, I just want to say thank you again to Jing, and join us in a couple weeks for our next Letterform lecture. Thanks again, everybody.
Thank you all. Cool beans.
Yeah, awesome. That was super interesting, Jing. I have to say, I mean, I'm no coder, right? I know nothing about any of that stuff, but it's fascinating to find out what's going on under the hood. You know what I mean?
Yeah, so that's the thing. I feel like we're developers, like we need to work on this. We need to work on being able to explain, but in an accessible manner. Because when we talk to each other, we're so lazy. We just jargon our way through the sentence. And any designer to sit next to the developers during the conversation, like, are they even speaking English? You know? And so because if we don't talk to people outside the industry enough, we get lazy, and then we get worse and worse at explaining things in an accessible manner, and that just deepens the divide, right? So I feel like this is, I'm also trying to practice like giving talks to folks that have like no idea how the web works. Because if I'm being honest, if I ask my mom, when my mom tells people like, oh, what does your daughter do? And like, she does computers. It's like, that's how I explain it. And if I get my mom to understand, I'm like, then I've passed the test. Like if your explanation passes the, you know, the friendly neighborhood elderly lady test, then I think it's a good explanation. Like, that's what I think. Yeah.
Totally. I know, I do. It's funny how sometimes we decide what we're going to tell people when they ask what our job is, you know. I mean, sometimes I just say I'm a teacher, you know. It's like, don't even bother trying to go into details on it, you know. But so I get that. I'm glad you've given your mom something that she can spread around to the neighborhood and feel proud of. Yeah. Okay, I guess we got to sign off for real this time. Thanks again, Skilla. Thanks again, Jing.
Thank you so much for having me.
We'll be in touch.
All
Ciao.
right, bye.